Radius.
So think about somebody who would say, hey, here's an address. I need a price and a turn time on a service. Instead of on a phone, now you've done it on a cloud-based, web-based platform. You've identified a property in seconds.
Yep.
You see property characteristics and attributes. And from this platform, you can order, status, get delivery, and archive everything we've got. So the proposal takes about 10 seconds. Normally it takes 2 days. So we've tried to create this commercial real estate due diligence storefront as a one-stop shop for all of these services across the country.
Hey, Anthony, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to join you.
Okay, so thanks to our wonderful friend Keisha, we got the opportunity to meet here. So could you please quick introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, I give a big shout out to the BDev gang and Keisha. They're a great investor of ours, and what a super firm. They help a lot of early stage portfolio companies, and we're lucky to have them. But yeah, a little bit about me. Prior to CREtelligent, started in software and technology sales. In 2000, co-founded another company with a business partner. We grew that. We sold that company to Intuit. And then I got very involved into Intuit. Big and they have so many different businesses. It was actually one of their subsidiaries called Demandforce. This was a kind of a customer relationship management platform for small and medium businesses, and it was a great fit for them. And then I got very involved in what you would call real estate technology. And it was a company in Sacramento doing fraud analytics, automated valuation models, a whole bunch of data and analytics for lenders on the residential mortgage side. And we grew that company to $65 million in sales. We rebranded that company to CoreLogic. And then we wound up selling that company to First American, who you'd think of as a $9 billion title company, but they were very acquisitive, lots of businesses under the hood. And so we got acquired. And then a couple of years later, First American decided to spin out CoreLogic and go public. So we took a bunch of other businesses with it. Post IPO, I stayed for about 3 years and ran what was called the global mortgage vertical. And then went back to First American in 2014 as in one of their businesses as chief revenue officer. And learned a lot about the commercial side of the world, unlike the resi side, and saw just massive dislocation, fragmentation, lack of optimization for transactions, et cetera. And that was kind of the birth of CREtelligent. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so CREtelligent, so you mentioned the reasons of name. Could you please tell about it?
Well, so the business existed before CREtelligent. It was a company called eScreenLogic. And it was a very kind of single-threaded environmental assessment business. In commercial real estate transactions, when you're doing due diligence, there's an environmental assessment. So this was a small business that we said, hey, we think we could raise funding. We think we could expand the strategy and the vision of the business. We rebranded the company to CREtelligent. And then we built platforms and added all the other data sets. And here we are almost 7 years later. Yeah.
How was your 2020?
Yeah, so we had really kind of launched a lot in 2019. And as we got into the beginning of 2020, we had raised our Series A financing. We were deploying capital in the business. We were hiring people, and then COVID hit. And so for every business, not just ours, but you had to navigate that. It was incredibly challenging. We went out and we raised some debt, and we just made sure that we took care of our employees. And we were designated at that time as a business that could continue to operate. So we actually had folks in the office during that period of time. We were still able to deliver for our customers, but of course revenues go down and the whole world was on pause. Yes. Even today, now we're multi-years later, if you think about commercial real estate, there's 9 asset classes and 140 property types. So multifamily, industrial, storage, retail, but the poster child is office. And of course, during COVID, everybody worked from home. And now it's been multiple years of trying to get everybody back in the office. So the value of the office here in San Francisco and in every city dramatically decreased, right? They had problems with vacancy and there was default and a lot of risk on those properties. That's really the only asset class over the last 3 years, though, that hasn't performed really well. So I would tell you commercial real estate today, pretty darn healthy. Even with interest rates as high as they are, I think many of our customers who are lenders and real estate investment trusts and owner operators, They have line of sight on where rates are. I think their cap rates and NOIs work because values have come down. So we've seen a burst in transaction volume across all of the different counterparties in the commercial real estate space.
Okay, so what is the kind of differentiation compared to other similar prop tech companies?
Yeah, great. Well, so I'm glad you said prop tech, because when you think about the umbrella of real estate technology, insure tech, construction tech, fintech that folks are aware of, and then property tech. Property is around the property itself, and there's property tech in residential real estate and property tech in commercial. And I think one of the things that's interesting when we talk about why are we doing what we're doing and how do you get excited about it, other than the single family house that you live in and a condo and a duplex, everything is commercial real estate, right? Your office, your gym, your store, your church, the golf course, go down the list, everything is commercial real estate. And so when those properties transact, an acquisition or disposition, there's all kinds of information, there's data, there's services, there's reports that are generally required during that transaction. And a lot of companies are what I would sort of call single-threaded. So I might provide an appraisal on a property, but if you need an environmental assessment, I don't do that. I might provide an environmental assessment, but if you need an ALTA boundary survey, I don't do that. I might provide ALTAs, but if you need zoning compliance or a flood zone determination or a litany of other services, you've got multiple providers that you're trying to work with. Often the conversation or the communication is, I'm going to call you or I'm going to email you, and I'm going to ask you for a proposal on a service for this address or a report that I need or something. You're going to take a day or two to get me this proposal. I'm going to respond by printing it and signing it and sending it back to you, and then you're going to perform whatever it is you're going to perform. For CREtelligent, we provide those services end to end, and we provide them via a platform called Radius. Radius. So think about somebody who would say, hey, here's an address. I need a price and a turn time on a service. Instead of on a phone, now you've done it on a cloud-based, web-based platform. You've identified a property in seconds. You see property characteristics and attributes. And from this platform, you can order, status, get delivery, and archive everything we've got. So the proposal takes about 10 seconds. Normally it takes 2 days, right?
Wow.
The identification of properties might take hours for folks. We do it in seconds. The property characteristics and attributes and data, you might have to go to 3 other places to get it. We put it in one spot. So we've tried to create this commercial real estate due diligence storefront as a one-stop shop for all of these services across the country. Yeah, I mean, for the customer, if you can collapse the cycle time and take days or weeks out of their process, all that means is you get into your building or business faster and get going. So the longer the process is, the more inefficient, the more costs, the more poor experience. Yeah.
I see. Okay. I would love to more like a deep dive. So who is the main customer?
Yeah. Great question. And I would tell you, we look at a segment vertical client. So a segment might be lender services. Lender, okay. And just by the virtue of lender, you know that there's inside of there's community banks, there's regional banks, there's national banks, there's non-bank lenders, there's commercial brokers. And there's about 10,000 of those folks across country. Very addressable market. We played that and kind of ran that same play in our past life at First American and CoreLogic. So we started with the lender because they have policy that says, okay, we're going to lend on this asset class at this amount of LTV, et cetera. Here's what we require to underwrite the loan. We need a full appraisal. We need a flood zone determination. We need a zoning compliance letter. We need a phase 1 environmental assessment. So the lender, when they're going to lend on that building, dictates, here's what we require. Now, they're the ordering party. So they'll come to CREtelligent based on the loan. They'll order these various products and services and reports, and then they'll close their loan. Similarly, the law firms, you wouldn't think about it, but there's both REIT and real estate practices inside of these big national law firms that are working with corporate clients, often on big portfolios. So somebody's going to go buy 30 storage units. They're going to buy 150 gas stations. Yeah. And on all of those, they need various services. So the law firms use us as a due diligence provider, as does the big publicly traded REITs. Right here in San Francisco is one of the largest industrial owner-operator in the country, called Prologis, big client of ours. Those folks, when they're going to go out and buy a building, they need all kinds of information, data services, etc. So there's really about 7 or 8 different sectors or verticals in the commercial real estate ecosystem. And it's a big market. We've got about 1,000 clients with a long way to go.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, 1,000 client. So do you remember your first paid client? Of course, almost all paid.
Yeah, I mean, we had on Radius, we sort of gave that platform away initially, and to get usage and to get people kind of excited about the platform, and then we started with subscription models, and we've got a bifurcated model where there's a subscription to the platform, pretty benign fees, and then you're kind of paying per report based on what you require on a transaction, and every individual, every firm has different needs and requirements. So we've got about 37 or 38 different type of reports and services that we offer. But yeah, I remember early 2019, our costs were a lot more than our revenue.
I see.
So we're now in a really good place financially. We've gone through a Series A funding. We've done a bunch of convertible notes that converted into our Series B financing, and so yeah, now we're sustainable and we're growing the business ferociously.
I see. So I'm curious. It's totally B2B business. So how did you research and got the client? So of course in your team, I can imagine in your team there are great experienced salespeople. Yeah.
Yeah, so the market, again, pretty addressable. So we know who is the counterparties in a transaction. We know who the broker is. We know who the buyers are, right? The corporations that buy properties. We know who the law firms are. We know who the title companies are. We know who the lenders are. So, and we understand the persona in each one of those companies that we need to get in front of that would be intrigued with what, sort of CREtelligent offers. We have an in-house demand generation team, kind of omni-channel demand gen. So today, just cold calling doesn't get it done. It's calls, it's emails, it's LinkedIn, it's direct mail. And you're just trying to get people intrigued enough to have a conversation. And I have found, and I do still to this day, a lot of demos with prospective clients. And usually the answer is like, oh my God, where has this been? Right? So when you compare what Radius and CREtelligent deliver to a customer versus what they do today, it's dramatic improvement. It's great utility and a very good ROI. So the sales team's been amazing at acquiring clients. In July, we brought on 56 new customers. We're continuing at that pace.
Speaking of sales, so now, Anthony, you are a CEO of CREtelligent, but your career start was salesperson.
Yeah, it was. I mean, graduated it with business and economics degree. Really got into the sales and business development side of the organization. I was really fortunate at First American to work with and for some really great mentors, where I got to see the other areas of the business, technology and finance, et cetera. And so, it was a bit of a learning curve. There's no doubt that as the CEO, I mean, I look at my role as raising and deploying capital. Setting culture and ethos, building the vision and strategy, and then controlling the pace, because often in early stage companies you can burn out and you can burn a lot of people out. But to do that, you've got to have at least a good degree of fluency in every functional area of the business, right? If you don't understand the P&L, can't be a great CEO. If you don't understand go-to-market strategy, probably not going to be the best CEO. If you don't know how to put together a tech stack and what a dev team's doing, can't be a great CEO. So some of that's been a learning, but a lot of it's in a rearview mirror.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Anthony, part 1. 1. Sales-driven growth momentum. CREtelligent isn't just building tech. It's winning customer first. From its first client in 2019, the company has now grown to 1,000 plus customers across lenders, law firms, REITs, and brokers. In July alone, brought on 56 new customers, showing strong demand and market fit. 2. Radius, a one-stop cloud diligent platform. Unlike traditional providers that only handle one piece of due diligence, like appraisals or environmental checks, Radius delivers 37 plus service end-to-end seconds, not days. Customers got property data, proposals, compliance reports, and delivery in one cloud platform, eliminating the inefficiency of juggling multiple vendors. This all-in-one diligence storefront is what sets CREtelligent apart. 3. Why investors backed CREtelligent? This unique combination of rapid customer acquisitions plus a differentiated platform has allowed CREtelligent to secure Series A convertible notes and Series B funding. Investors see that Radius isn't just another prop tech tool. It's building the infrastructure backnote for how commercial real estate due diligence is done, collapsing cycle time and unlocking ROI at scale. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. And next episode is the conversation with Anthony part 2. Please stay tuned. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。